Did a teenage queen really say, let them eat cake while her people starved? Did a famous Egyptian ruler spend all her time just seducing powerful men? Why do we remember a queen for a fictional love affair, but forget she commanded armies? Hollywood loves a good story, but sometimes the truth is more interesting. And often, the women who ruled nations were smarter, tougher, and more complicated than the simple characters we see on screen. They were politicians, leaders, and survivors, not just wives or lovers. Their real lives were full of difficult choices, not just fancy dresses and dramatic romances. Number 21 was Cleopatra only defined by the men she loved. Cleopatra VII was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. She was not ethnically Egyptian. Her family line was Greek Macedonian, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. In 300 years, she was the first ruler in her family to bother learning the Egyptian language. Coins minted during her reign show her with a prominent nose and a strong chin, not the delicate features of a Hollywood actress. Her real power came from her mind, not her appearance. Ancient writers, even her enemies, focused on her intelligence and her charming voice, not her beauty. The 1963 film Cleopatra is a spectacle. Elizabeth Taylor plays the Egyptian queen as a master of seduction. Her entire story revolves around her relationships with two Roman men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The movie presents her as a woman who used her beauty and charm to manipulate powerful men. Her political ambitions are shown as extensions of her love affairs. She is dramatic, emotional, and ultimately a tragic, romantic figure. Her power seems to come from her ability to captivate men, not from her ability to rule. The reality was far more complex. Cleopatra was a shrewd politician from a young age. She came to the throne at 18, sharing it with her 10-year-old brother, who was also her husband, as was the custom. A few years later, his advisors drove her out of Egypt. She didn't just give up. She raised her own army to fight for her throne. This is when she met Julius Caesar. The famous story of her being smuggled to him in a carpet is true. But it wasn't just a dramatic entrance, it was a calculated risk. It was a brilliant move to bypass her brother's forces and get a private audience with the most powerful man in the world. She needed his support to regain her power. Their relationship was a strategic alliance. For Caesar, supporting Cleopatra meant securing Egypt, which was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. It was a vital source of grain for Rome. For Cleopatra, Caesar was the military muscle she needed to defeat her brother and secure her rule. Their son, Caesarion, was not just a product of passion. He was a powerful political statement. He was Caesar's only son, a potential heir who could unite Rome and Egypt. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra didn't just mourn. She navigated the treacherous Roman power struggles that followed. Her relationship with Mark Antony was similar. It was a partnership, both personal and political. Antony controlled the eastern provinces of the Roman Republic. Together, they represented a formidable power bloc that challenged Caesar's heir, Octavian. They had 3 children together and ruled from Alexandria. Cleopatra wasn't just a consort, she was an active co-ruler. She financed Antony's military campaigns. She commanded her own naval fleet at the Battle of Actium. She was a CEO, a general, and a head of state. She was a scholar who spoke at least 9 languages and wrote books on medicine and philosophy. The movie reduces this brilliant political operator to a woman driven by love. The real Cleopatra was driven by power and the survival of her kingdom. The Roman propaganda written by her enemy Octavian painted her as a foreign temptress to justify his war against her. Hollywood simply adopted this ancient smear campaign because a tragic love story sells more tickets than a lesson in geopolitical economics. Number 20 was Marie Antoinette, a clueless fashionista. The real Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." This phrase was attributed to her years later by her political enemies to make her seem out of touch. She was married at 14 and became queen at 19. She was a foreigner in a court full of complex rules and political enemies. Her personal spending, while high, accounted for only a tiny fraction of the French state's massive debt. Most of the debt came from expensive wars, including France's support for the American Revolution. Sofia Coppola's 2006 film Marie Antoinette portrays the queen as a sympathetic but ultimately frivolous teenager. The movie is a visual treat full of pastel colors, lavish parties, and incredible costumes. It shows her as a young girl, overwhelmed by the strict etiquette of the French court at Versailles. She finds escape in fashion, gambling, and friendship. The film focuses on her personal life and her isolation. It presents her as a style icon, a pop princess in a historical setting, but it largely ignores the massive political and social storm brewing outside the palace walls. The revolution, when it comes, feels like it happens to her, rather than because of anything she did. While the film captures her youth and isolation well, it downplays her role and her development as a political figure. The real Marie Antoinette was not a political lightweight her entire life. In her early years as queen, she was indeed focused on her social life. She created her own private world at the Petit Trianon, a small chateau on the grounds of Versailles, to escape the suffocating pressures of the court. This was seen as scandalous. A queen was supposed to live her life in public. Her friendships and her spending on fashion and jewels were used against her. She became a target for pamphlets and cartoons that spread vicious rumors. But as the crisis in France deepened, she changed. She became much more involved in politics, especially after her husband, King Louis XVI, grew increasingly indecisive and depressed. She was a staunch defender of the monarchy. She tried to navigate the treacherous political landscape. She corresponded with other European leaders seeking support for her family. She was involved in planning the family's failed attempt to flee France in 1791. This wasn't the action of a ditzy teenager, it was the desperate move of a queen trying to save her family and the institution she represented. She also had a strong sense of duty, especially towards her children. The movie touches on her role as a mother, but doesn't fully explore how it grounded her. The historical Marie Antoinette faced unimaginable tragedy and pressure with considerable courage. During her trial, she was accused of terrible things, and she defended herself with intelligence and dignity. The movie ends before these darker, more complex years. By focusing only on her party girl phase, the film creates an incomplete picture. It makes her seem like a victim of circumstance, a butterfly caught in a hurricane. The real woman was more than that. She was a player in the game, even if she ultimately lost. The film chose an aesthetic and a mood over a full historical portrait. It wanted to show us a relatable teenager, not a queen fighting for her life and her crown. Number 19. Did Queen Isabella of Castile just fund a famous voyage? And Isabella I of Castile was a formidable ruler in her own right, long before Christopher Columbus appeared. She fought a civil war to secure her own throne against her niece, Juana. She was a military leader who often wore armor and rode with her troops. She and her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, were not just co-monarchs. They ruled their own kingdoms independently, but acted together on foreign policy. She was deeply involved in the governance of Castile, reforming the government and the justice system. She was known for her strong will and her sharp political mind. The 1992 film 1492 Conquest of Paradise shows Queen Isabella primarily through the eyes of Christopher Columbus. She is portrayed as a pious and thoughtful supporter of his ambitious plan to sail west to reach the East Indies. She listens to his arguments, is swayed by his passion, and ultimately decides to fund his voyage against the advice of her skeptical counselors. In the film, her role is largely reactive. She is the powerful patron, the one who says eyes to the great man's dream. Her own political goals and her complex reign are just a backdrop for Columbus's story. This portrayal reduces one of the most significant rulers of the Renaissance to a supporting character in someone else's adventure. The real Isabella's decision to fund Columbus was a calculated political and economic gamble, not just a leap of faith. For years, she and Ferdinand were preoccupied with a major military campaign, the final phase of the Reconquista, the effort to take back Spanish territory from the Moorish kingdoms. This campaign ended in January 1492 with the fall of Granada. It was only after this victory that they had the resources and the attention to spare for Columbus's proposal. Their motivation was not just exploration, it was about competition. Their neighbor, Portugal, was dominating the lucrative sea routes around Africa to the spice markets of Asia. Spain was being left behind. Columbus offered a potential shortcut, a way to break the Portuguese monopoly and open up a new source of wealth for Spain. Isabella was a canny ruler. She understood the potential rewards. She didn't just passively agree. She drove a hard bargain. The initial terms Columbus demanded were so high that her council rejected them. It took further negotiation before an agreement was reached. Furthermore, Isabella was a powerful and active ruler of a massive kingdom. The film barely touches on the scope of her governance. She centralized power, creating a more modern and efficient state. She established a national police force to curb the power of rebellious nobles. She oversaw legal reforms. She and Ferdinand also made decisions with profound and lasting consequences, such as the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. These were not minor policy points. They were central aspects of their reign, driven by a vision of a unified Catholic Spain. To portray her simply as the queen who gave Columbus 3 ships is like describing a CEO of a multinational corporation as the person who approved one department's budget. It completely misses the scale and complexity of her power and her impact on history. Number 18 was Empress Elizabeth of Austria, just a fairy tale princess. The Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, was married at 16. She suffered from what was likely an eating disorder and was obsessed with her appearance, maintaining a tiny waist and spending hours on her elaborate hair care. She wrote poetry and felt a deep connection to Hungary, playing a key role in creating the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy in 1867. She spent much of her life traveling to escape the rigid Habsburg court, which she despised. She was a restless and melancholic figure, not a happy-go-lucky royal. The popular Sisi film trilogy from the 1950s, starring Romy Schneider, cemented a romantic and completely inaccurate image of the Empress. The films portray Sisi as a sweet, charming, and slightly rebellious girl from the countryside who captures the heart of Emperor Franz Joseph. It is a classic fairy tale romance. She is shown as a beloved public figure who easily wins over the people and navigates court life with grace and innocence. The films are cheerful, colorful, and overwhelmingly positive. They depict a perfect love story set against the backdrop of a glorious empire. This sugar-coated version could not be further from the truth. The real Elizabeth's life was marked by tragedy and personal struggle. She found the Habsburg court in Vienna to be suffocating and hostile. Her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, was a domineering figure who constantly criticized Elizabeth and took control of her children's upbringing. Elizabeth's first child died in infancy, a loss from which she never fully recovered. She had a difficult relationship with her husband, the emperor. While he loved her, he was a rigid and unimaginative man devoted to his duties, and he did not understand her complex emotional needs. Far from being a happy princess, Elizabeth was often deeply unhappy. She suffered from bouts of depression, which she called her black moods. Her obsession with her beauty was not simple. Vanity. It was a way to exert control in a life where she felt powerless. She followed extreme diets and engaged in rigorous exercise routines. This was a coping mechanism, not a fairy tale preoccupation. She used illness, both real and exaggerated, as an excuse to flee Vienna for long periods. She traveled to Greece, England, and Ireland, finding solace in poetry, horse riding, and the sea. Her political influence was real, but it was not the easy, charming influence shown in the films. Her advocacy for Hungary was a serious political endeavor. She learned Hungarian and developed a deep affection for the Hungarian people and their culture. Her pressure on her husband was a key factor in the 1867 compromise that gave Hungary more autonomy and created the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was a major political achievement born of genuine interest and savvy negotiation, not girlish charm. Her life ended tragically when she was assassinated by an anarchist in 1898. The Sisi films created a myth that completely erased the sad, complicated, and far more interesting reality of the woman's life. They gave the world a fairy tale it wanted, but it was a work of fiction. Number 17 was Catherine de' Medici, a scheming poisoner. Catherine de' Medici was the queen consort of France and later regent for her three sons who became kings. She was a major patron of the arts, funding huge architectural projects and bringing Italian cultural influences like ballet and ice cream to France. She ruled France as regent for years and was the most powerful person in the country for a long period. She tried to steer a middle course between the warring Catholic and Protestant factions in France, a policy that ultimately failed. She had 10 children, but several died young. The television series Ren is a historical fantasy that uses real names but has little connection to actual events. In this show, and in many other popular portrayals, Catherine de' Medici is depicted as the quintessential villainous queen. She is a master of poisons, a ruthless schemer, and a cold-hearted manipulator. She is often seen consulting with mystics like Nostradamus and plotting against her daughter-in-law, Mary, Queen of Scots. She is driven by a desire for power and a belief that the ends always justify the means. This image of her as a dark, occult, loving Italian poisoner has been a popular stereotype for centuries. This portrayal is largely a product of propaganda from her own time. As an Italian and a woman in a position of immense power, she was an easy target for her political enemies. The French Wars of Religion were a brutal and complex period, and she was at the center of the storm. Her attempts at compromise were seen as weakness by hardliners on both the Catholic and Protestant sides. When she did use ruthless tactics, it was in a political environment where everyone was using them. The black legend of Catherine the Poisoner was a smear campaign designed to discredit her. While she was undoubtedly a tough and pragmatic politician, there is no solid historical evidence that she was a habitual poisoner. This was a common accusation in the 16th century, an easy way to blame someone for a sudden death in an age before modern medicine. The real Catherine was a dedicated, if sometimes flawed, ruler who worked tirelessly to preserve the French monarchy for her sons. She was a master of diplomacy and political negotiation. She organized lavish court festivals and spectacles, not just for fun, but as a form of political theater, a way to project an image of royal power and unity during a time of chaos. Her most controversial act was her involvement in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, a wave of violence against French Protestants. Her exact role and motivations are still debated by historians. She likely approved a plan to eliminate a few key Protestant leaders who she believed were plotting a coup. She probably did not intend for the widespread slaughter that followed, but she was a ruler making a brutal calculation in a brutal time, not a cartoon villain cackling over a bubbling cauldron. Ren and similar shows take the propaganda about Catherine at face value because it makes for a more dramatic character. It's easier to write a simple villain than a complex stateswoman trying to hold a country together as it tears itself apart. Number 16 was Margaret of Anjou, a vicious she-wolf. Margaret of Anjou was the English queen consort to King Henry VI. She came to England from France at 15 as part of a peace treaty. Her husband suffered from severe mental illness, experiencing long periods where he was completely unresponsive. During these times, she effectively ruled in his place. She led the Lancastrian faction in the Wars of the Roses for years, raising armies and directing campaigns to protect her husband's crown and her son's inheritance. She was a military leader and the head of a political party for much of her adult life. In William Shakespeare's plays like Henry VI, and in television adaptations like The White Queen, Margaret of Anjou is often portrayed as the she-wolf of France. She is depicted as ruthless, cruel, and unnaturally aggressive for a woman of her time. She is shown as the real power behind her weak husband, but her ambition is presented as a negative, destructive force. She is often contrasted with the more properly feminine women of the Yorkist side. Her actions are driven by personal vengeance and a thirst for power, rather than a legitimate desire to protect her family's claim to the throne. This portrayal is heavily influenced by Yorkist propaganda from the period. Shakespeare's plays were written under the Tudor dynasty, which had a vested interest in portraying the Lancastrians, and especially Margaret, in a negative light to legitimize their own rule. The nickname She-Wolf was a piece of political slander designed to paint her as unnatural and dangerous. The reality is that Margaret was a queen in an impossible situation. Her husband was incapable of ruling. The nobles of the court were ambitious and divided. The rival House of York, led by Richard, Duke of York, had a strong claim to the throne. If she did not act, her son, Edward of Lancaster, would be disinherited and her family would lose everything. Her actions were not driven by simple bloodlust. They were the actions of a queen and a mother fighting for survival. She had to be tough. She traveled the country to rally support, negotiated with foreign powers for aid, and personally directed military strategy. These were roles that English queens were not expected to play, but she had no choice. She was acting as the head of the government because her husband could not. Of course, her enemies portrayed this as monstrous and unnatural. They couldn't attack the king directly without being traitors, so they attacked his foreign-born, strong-willed wife instead. The White Queen continues this tradition. It presents her as a bitter and vengeful figure driven by hatred for the Yorks. It simplifies her motivations and ignores the incredible political and logistical challenges she faced. The historical Margaret was a brilliant and resilient leader who kept the Lancastrian cause alive for years through sheer force of will. She was a political general in a civil war. To reduce her to a one-dimensional, power-hungry villain is to ignore the context of her time and the desperate circumstances she was forced to navigate. She was not a monster. She was a queen doing what she had to do to protect her kingdom and her son. Number 15 was Boudica, a Celtic freedom fighter. Boudica was a queen of the Iceni, a Celtic tribe in eastern England during the 1st century AD. After her husband, King Prasutagus, died, the Romans annexed his kingdom. They ignored his will, which left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman emperor. Roman financiers called in their loans. Boudica was flogged, and her daughters were assaulted. This brutal mistreatment led her to lead a massive rebellion against the Roman occupation. Her army destroyed 3 Roman cities, including Londinium, London. The 2003 film Boudica, also known as Warrior Queen, presents her as a proto-nationalist hero. She is a symbol of British resistance against a foreign invader. The film portrays her as a noble leader fighting for the freedom of her people. It's a classic underdog story, a tale of a wronged woman seeking justice and leading her people in a glorious, if ultimately doomed, fight for liberty. This image of Boudica as a patriotic freedom fighter is a very modern one, popular since the Victorian era when she was rediscovered as a symbol of the British Empire. This modern interpretation projects our own ideas about nationalism and freedom onto the past. The real Boudica was not fighting for a unified Britain. The concept of Britain as a single nation did not exist yet. She was the queen of the Iceni tribe. Her rebellion was an alliance of several different tribes, each with their own interests. Their primary motivation was likely a combination of revenge for the personal atrocities committed against her and her family, and a desire to throw off the heavy burden of Roman taxation and rule. It was a tribal uprising, not a national war of independence. The Roman historian Tacitus, our main source for these events, describes the rebellion as incredibly brutal. Boudica's army did not just defeat the Roman legions in battle, they utterly destroyed the cities of Camulodunum, Colchester, Londinium, and Verulamium St. Albans. According to Roman accounts, they slaughtered the inhabitants, Roman and Briton alike, who did not flee. Tacitus claims that as many as 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed. The movie, like many modern retellings, tends to downplay the sheer ferocity and violence of the rebels. It focuses on the heroism of their cause and sanitizes the reality of ancient warfare. Furthermore, the film gives Boudica a more central, strategic command role than she might have had. While she was undoubtedly the charismatic leader and the unifying symbol of the rebellion, the military actions would have been directed by various tribal chieftains. The image of her as a single general commanding a unified army is a simplification. The rebellion was a powerful but ultimately short-lived explosion of anger. it was eventually crushed by the professional Roman army under Governor Suetonius Paulinus. The film creates a powerful myth of a national hero, but the historical reality was a more localized, chaotic, and brutal affair, rooted in a specific tribal context and driven by a potent desire for revenge. Number 14 was Wu Zetian, a power-mad tyrant. Wu Zetian was the only woman to ever rule China in her own right, not as a regent or consort, but as emperor. She founded her own dynasty, the Zhou. She started her life at court as a concubine to Emperor Taizong. After his death, she became a concubine, and then the empress consort of his son, Emperor Gaozong. After Gaozong's death, she ruled through her sons before eventually taking the throne herself in 690 AD. Her reign was a time of major expansion of the empire and relative prosperity. She promoted Buddhism over Taoism as the state religion. She was also known for her use of a secret police to eliminate her rivals. Many Chinese television dramas and popular histories portray Wu Zetian in one of two extreme ways. Either she is a deeply villainous and illegitimate ruler who usurped power through murder and deceit, or she is a misunderstood proto-feminist hero who did what she had to do in a patriarchal society. The villainous portrayal often focuses on lurid and unproven stories, such as the tale that she murdered her own infant daughter to frame a rival. She is shown as a cruel and paranoid tyrant who trusted no one and ruthlessly eliminated anyone who stood in her way. This one-dimensional view of her as a monster is largely based on Confucian historiography written after her death, or Confucian scholars who believe firmly in a patriarchal social order were horrified by the idea of a woman ruling as emperor. It went against everything they believed about the proper order of the universe. Therefore, they had a strong motive to portray her reign as a dark and illegitimate period in Chinese history. They exaggerated her cruelty and downplayed her achievements. The story of her killing her own baby, for instance, has no contemporary evidence and may have been invented to demonize her. The real Wu Zetian was an exceptionally skilled politician. She had to be. To rise from a mid-level concubine to the absolute ruler of China required incredible intelligence, political savvy, and ruthlessness. She was an effective administrator. She recruited talented officials based on merit, not just aristocratic birth, through the imperial examination system. This weakened the power of the old noble families who were her main opponents. She oversaw successful military campaigns that expanded Chinese influence in Central Asia. Her economic policies were generally successful, and the country was stable for most of her reign. She did use a secret police to purge her enemies, and many people were executed or exiled. This was a brutal aspect of her rule, but this was not unique to her. Many male emperors throughout Chinese history used similar methods to consolidate their power. When a man did it, it was often seen as a sign of strong leadership. When Wu Zetian did it, it was used by her detractors as evidence of her uniquely feminine cruelty and paranoia. The portrayals that paint her as a simple tyrant ignore her competence as a ruler and the context of the political world she inhabited. She was a complex and formidable leader who ruled a vast empire for decades. Reducing her to a caricature of a power-hungry woman misses the real story of her remarkable and unprecedented career. His number 13 was Queen Christina of Sweden, an ice queen who hated her country. Queen Christina of Sweden came to the throne at the age of 6. She was raised like a prince, receiving a rigorous education in politics, philosophy, and languages. She was a brilliant intellectual who corresponded with the philosopher René Descartes. She was a major patron of the arts and sciences, bringing scholars and artists to her court in Stockholm. She refused to marry, causing a succession crisis. In 1654, at the age of 28, she shocked Europe by abdicating her throne, converting to Catholicism, and moving to Rome. The 1933 film Queen Christina, starring Greta Garbo, is the most famous portrayal of her. The film invents a passionate love affair with a Spanish ambassador. It suggests that she abdicated her throne for love, choosing a private life with the man she loved over her public duty. She is portrayed as a woman torn between her masculine upbringing and her natural feminine desires. Her famous line, "I shall die a bachelor," is delivered with a sense of romantic tragedy. The film presents her as a cold and lonely queen who is thawed by love. This focus on a fictional romance completely misrepresents the real Christina and her motivations. There is no evidence for the love affair depicted in the film. The historical Christina's reasons for abdicating were far more complex and interesting. They were intellectual, spiritual, and political. Firstly, she had a deep-seated aversion to marriage. She had seen the lives of other royal women and had no desire to be a political pawn or to cede her authority to a husband. She declared early on that she would not marry. This created a problem for the succession, which she solved by naming her cousin Charles Gustav as her heir. Secondly, she was growing increasingly fascinated with Catholicism. Sweden was a staunchly Protestant nation, a major power in the 30 Years' War. For the Swedish monarch to even consider converting was a monumental and dangerous act. Her conversion was the result of years of secret study and spiritual questioning. It was an intellectual and religious journey, not a romantic whim. She could not be a Catholic and remain Queen of Sweden. And abdication was the only path. Thirdly, she may have simply grown tired of ruling. She was an intellectual, not a politician. She found the day-to-day business of government to be tedious. She preferred to spend her time with books, art, and scholars. By abdicating, she freed herself from the responsibilities of the crown. She moved to Rome, where she became a central figure in the city's cultural and intellectual life. She established a renowned salon, patronized artists like Bernini, and continued her studies. She did not retire into a quiet private life with a lover. She created a new unconventional life for herself as a free intellectual and a prominent European figure. The Garbo film chose a simple, relatable story, a woman giving up everything for love over the much more challenging and radical truth of a woman who gave up a throne for intellectual and spiritual freedom. Number 12 was Juana of Castile. Really mad. Juana of Castile was the daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. She was married to Philip the Handsome, an archduke from the powerful Habsburg dynasty. After the deaths of her mother and older siblings, she became the heir to the Kingdom of Castile. Her husband, Philip, and later her father, Ferdinand, and then her son, Charles V, all sought to rule in her name. She was confined to a castle in Tordesillas for 46 years until her death. Her nickname is Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. The 2001 Spanish film, Juana la Loca, released as Mad Love in English, leans heavily into the traditional narrative of Juana's madness. It portrays her as a woman consumed by an obsessive, jealous love for her unfaithful husband, Philip. Her emotional outbursts, her possessiveness, and her grief after his early death are presented as clear signs of insanity. The film suggests that her mental instability made her unfit to rule, thus justifying her long confinement. It is a story of tragic, pathological love that leads to madness. The historical reality is much murkier, and it is highly likely that the story of Juana's madness was a convenient political tool used by the men in her life to usurp her power. Juana was the legitimate Queen of Castile, but her husband, her father, and her son all wanted to control the wealthy and powerful kingdom. By declaring her mentally unstable, they could legally set her aside and rule as her regent. There is no doubt that Juana was a passionate and emotionally intense person. She may have suffered from a mental illness, perhaps depression or another condition, which was likely exacerbated by the constant betrayals and political maneuvering she endured. But was she mad in the sense of being completely incompetent to rule? It's questionable. The stories that are often used as proof of her insanity, like the one about her traveling with her husband's coffin for months, refusing to be parted from it, can also be interpreted in other ways. This could have been an extreme act of grief or even a savvy political move. As long as she had the body of her husband, the father of the heir, she was a powerful symbol of legitimacy. She was preventing her father Ferdinand from taking control too quickly. The men around her had every reason to exaggerate or even invent tales of her bizarre behavior. Reports of her instability were circulated to justify their political actions. For nearly half a century, the rightful Queen of Castile was kept a prisoner while others ruled in her name. She was a political inconvenience. The label of madness was the perfect way to neutralize her. The film, by focusing so intensely on her romantic obsession, perpetuates this narrative. It presents her as a purely emotional, irrational creature, a victim of her own feelings. It doesn't sufficiently question whether her so-called madness was a diagnosis or a political strategy used against her. It tells the story her male relatives wanted the world to believe. Number 11 was Eleanor of Aquitaine, just a scheming meddler. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, a vast and wealthy territory in what is now France. She was first Queen of France, married to Louis VII, and then Queen of England, married to Henry II. She was the mother of two English kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. She went on the Second Crusade. She was a major patron of the arts, particularly the poetry of courtly love. She lived into her 80s and was politically active for most of her life. The 1968 film The Lion in Winter is a masterpiece of acting and dialogue, but it presents a very specific version of Eleanor. Katharine Hepburn's Oscar-winning portrayal shows Eleanor in middle age, temporarily released from the castle where her husband, Henry II, has imprisoned her. The film depicts her as a brilliant, witty, but deeply bitter schemer. Her life is a constant battle of wits with Henry. Her political actions are driven by a mix of love, hate, and a desire for revenge against her husband. She manipulates her three sons, pitting them against each other and against their father in a bid to secure her own influence. She is a powerful but ultimately tragic figure trapped in a dysfunctional family power struggle. While the film brilliantly captures her intelligence and strong will, it frames her entire political career through the lens of her personal relationship with Henry. It makes her actions seem like reactions to his infidelity and his attempts to control her. The real Eleanor was a political power long before she ever met Henry. As Duchess of Aquitaine, she was the most eligible heiress in Europe. Her first marriage to the King of France was annulled partly because she failed to produce a male heir, but also because she was a far more forceful and worldly personality than her pious husband. She famously complained that she had married a monk, not a king. Her marriage to Henry II was initially a powerful partnership. It controlled a vast territory, the Angevin Empire, that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but as their sons grew up, conflicts arose over their inheritance. Eleanor supported her sons in a rebellion against their father in 1173. When the rebellion failed, Henry had her imprisoned. This is the context for The Lion in Winter. But even from prison, she remained a political force. After Henry's death, her son Richard the Lionheart became king and immediately released her. While Richard was away on the Third Crusade, Eleanor, then in her late 60s, effectively governed England. She managed the kingdom's finances, raised Richard's ransom when he was captured, and put down a rebellion by her youngest son, John. Even in her old age, she was a formidable diplomat, traveling across the Alps to arrange a marriage for her granddaughter. Her political life was not just about her battles with Henry. She was a ruler in her own right, a regent, a diplomat, and the head of a powerful dynasty. The Lion in Winter is great drama, but it reduces a 60-year political career to a single toxic family Christmas. Number 10, did Queen Anne spend her reign playing with rabbits? And Queen Anne was the last monarch of the House of Stuart. During her reign, 1702 to 1714, England and Scotland were formally united to create Great Britain. The country was a major player in the War of the Spanish Succession, a huge European conflict. The two-party political system, Whigs and Tories, became dominant during her time. She was a hard-working and conscientious monarch who attended cabinet meetings more regularly than many of her predecessors. She suffered from terrible health her entire life, including gout so severe she sometimes had to be carried in a sedan chair. She had at least 17 pregnancies, but not a single child survived to adulthood. The 2018 film The Favorite is a stylish and darkly comedic look at Queen Anne's court. It focuses on the intense personal and political rivalry between two of her court ladies, Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and her cousin, Abigail Hill. The film portrays Anne, played by Olivia Colman, as a frail, insecure, and childlike monarch. She is easily manipulated by her favorites. She seems more interested in her pet rabbits, one for each of the children she lost, than in the affairs of state. The major political decisions of her reign, like the continuation of the war with France, are shown as outcomes of the petty jealousies and power games of the two women vying for her affection. This portrayal, while brilliant as a piece of cinema, is a significant distortion of the real Queen Anne. The historical Anne was not a political puppet. She was a monarch with strong opinions and a deep sense of duty. She was the one who made the final decisions. The rivalry between Sarah Churchill and Abigail Hill was very real, and it did have political consequences. Sarah was a lifelong friend of Anne's and a powerful advocate for the Whig Party, which supported the war. Abigail was more aligned with the Tories, who wanted to seek peace. Anne's shift in favor from Sarah to Abigail did coincide with a shift in political power from the Whigs to the Tories. However, the film suggests that this shift was almost entirely due to Anne's emotional whims and her manipulation by Abigail. In reality, Anne's break with Sarah Churchill was the result of years of political and personal disagreements. Sarah was a notoriously domineering and sharp-tongued woman who often lectured and bullied the Queen. Anne grew tired of being treated this way. Her move towards the Tories was also a reflection of her own political and religious beliefs. She was a devout Anglican and was more comfortable with the high church Tories than the more religiously liberal Whigs. And the rabbits, they are complete fabrication. There is no historical record of Queen Anne keeping rabbits as surrogates for her lost children. They are a powerful cinematic device, a visual metaphor for her grief and her perceived weakness, but they are not history. The real Queen Anne was a tragic figure, plagued by ill health and personal loss, but she was also a dedicated and often stubborn ruler who took her responsibilities seriously. And The Favorite reduces her to a pathetic and passive character in a drama created by others. The real Anne was the center of her own court, not just its emotional victim. Number 9 was Isabella of France, a romantic heroine. And Isabella of France was the daughter of the powerful French King Philip IV. She was married to King Edward II of England to seal a peace treaty. Her husband, Edward, was famously devoted to his male favorites, first Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser. He neglected Isabella and confiscated her lands. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France on a diplomatic mission. She refused to return. She began a relationship with an exiled English baron, Roger Mortimer. Together, they raised an army, invaded England in 1326, and overthrew her husband. They ruled as regents for her young son, Edward III. The 1995 film Braveheart gives Isabella a completely fictional role. It portrays her as a sympathetic princess trapped in a loveless political marriage. She is sent by her father-in-law, the English King Edward I, to negotiate with William Wallace. She is impressed by Wallace's integrity and secretly falls in love with him. They have a clandestine affair, and the film implies that her son, the future Edward III, was actually Wallace's child. She is shown as a compassionate figure who betrays English secrets to help the Scottish cause. This is pure Hollywood fantasy. Every single aspect of this portrayal is historically inaccurate. The real Isabella of France was a child when many of the events of the film took place. She did not even arrive in England and marry Edward II until 1308, 3 years after the real William Wallace was executed. She never met William Wallace. The idea that she had an affair with him and that he fathered her child is a complete invention created for the movie to add a romantic subplot. The historical Edward III was most certainly the son of Edward III. Furthermore, the real Isabella was no gentle, love-struck heroine. She was a formidable and ruthless political operator. After years of being humiliated and sidelined by her husband and his favorites, she seized her opportunity. Her invasion of England was not a romantic escapade. It was a brilliantly executed coup d'etat. She was a skilled diplomat who secured support from the French court and other allies. She was a military leader who landed on English soil with a small army and quickly gathered support from the many English nobles who were discontented with Edward II's rule. Her and Mortimer's short reign was controversial and ended when her son, Edward III, reached adulthood, seized power, and had Mortimer executed. But Isabella's story is remarkable enough without adding a fictional romance with a Scottish rebel. She is one of the few English queens to have successfully led an invasion and deposed her own husband. She was a she-wolf in her own right, a woman who took power into her own hands. Braveheart ignores this incredible true story and instead uses her as a romantic prop in a man's story, reducing a queen to a damsel in distress and a secret lover. Number 8 was Queen Victoria, a lifelong mourner. Queen Victoria reigned for 63 years, a period of immense industrial, social, and imperial expansion for Britain known as the Victorian era. She married her cousin, Prince Albert, in 1840, and they had a famously happy marriage and 9 children. Albert died in 1861 at the age of 42. Victoria was devastated and went into a deep state of mourning, wearing black for the rest of her life. She withdrew from public life for many years. Many films and television shows, especially those focusing on her later years, tend to portray Queen Victoria as defined by her grief. And she is often depicted as a stern, unsmiling woman in black, a perpetual widow lost in the past. Shows like Victoria do an excellent job of depicting her early reign and her romance with Albert, but the popular image of the older Victoria is one of solemn, almost permanent mourning. This image suggests that after Albert died, her life effectively stopped, and she simply endured the remaining 40 years of her reign. While her grief for Albert was profound and genuinely lifelong, this portrayal is incomplete. It risks overshadowing the fact that she remained a powerful and engaged monarch for 4 decades after his death. After her initial period of seclusion, she gradually returned to her royal duties. She was not a passive figurehead. She was a monarch who read every government dispatch and maintained a massive correspondence with her ministers and with other European royals. She had strong and often very conservative political opinions, and she was not shy about expressing them. She clashed with prime ministers, particularly William Gladstone, whom she detested. She was a staunch supporter of the British Empire and took a keen interest in its expansion and governance. She became the Empress of India in 1876, a title she cherished. She was a powerful symbol of British identity and stability. In her later years, her public appearances for her golden and diamond jubilees were met with huge displays of public affection. She became a beloved grandmotherly figure to the nation. Furthermore, her personal life did not end with Albert's death. Her close relationship with her Scottish servant, John Brown, was a source of great scandal and is explored in the film Nurse Brown. While the exact nature of their relationship is debated, he brought her comfort and helped coax her out of her seclusion. After his death, she developed a similarly close relationship with an Indian servant, Abdul Karim. These relationships show that she was still capable of forming deep, meaningful, and controversial personal attachments long after Albert was gone. To remember her only as the Widow of Windsor is to ignore the second half of her long and eventful reign. She was a grieving wife, yes, but she was also a working empress, a political force, and a complex woman until the day she died. Number 7 was Catherine the Great's rise to power of fun romp. Catherine the Great was born a minor German princess named Sophie. She was brought to Russia to marry the heir, the future Peter III. Their marriage was a disaster. Peter was immature and unpopular. In 1762, Just 6 months after he became emperor, Catherine led a coup with the help of the military and her lover, Grigory Orlov. Peter was forced to abdicate and was killed shortly after. Catherine then ruled Russia as empress for 34 years. Her reign is considered a golden age, a time of territorial expansion, administrative reform, and cultural flourishing. She corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire. The television series The Great presents itself as an occasionally true story. It is a satirical and comedic take on Catherine's early years in Russia. The show portrays her as a naive but idealistic young woman who arrives at a boorish and backward Russian court. She is horrified by her oafish husband, Peter, and the ridiculousness of court life. The show focuses on her witty banter, her romantic entanglements, and her comically inept attempts to plot a coup. Her rise to power is depicted as a funny, semi-farcical adventure. While the show is hugely entertaining and captures a certain spirit of absurdity, it completely changes the historical reality for comedic effect. The real Catherine was anything but naive. She was a highly intelligent, disciplined, and ambitious young woman who spent her first 18 years in Russia carefully observing the political landscape, learning the Russian language, and cultivating powerful allies. She was a master of public relations, converting to Russian Orthodoxy with great public piety and making sure she was seen as more Russian than her German-born husband, who openly admired Prussia, Russia's rival. Her coup was not a clumsy, funny affair. It was a swift, decisive, and bloodless seizure of power that she had been methodically planning. She had the support of the most powerful regiments in the military, the church, and the government bureaucracy. It was the result of years of patient political maneuvering. Peter was deeply unpopular, and Catherine presented herself as a viable and more competent alternative. The show also invents a different personality for her husband. The real Peter III was not just a fun-loving brute. He had some progressive ideas, but was politically inept and alienated everyone who mattered. The show's version of Peter is a far more charismatic and complex character than the historical figure, which makes for better television drama but less accurate history. The Great uses history as a playground. It takes the names and the basic situation, but changes the events, timelines, and personalities to create a witty satire about a young woman trying to bring enlightenment to a chaotic world. The real Catherine story is less of a comedy and more of a masterclass in political strategy and survival. She wasn't a lucky idealist, she was a brilliant and patient strategist who outplayed everyone around her. Number 6 was Elizabeth I, a weak and indecisive queen. Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years, a period known as the Elizabethan Age. She was the daughter of Henry V and Anne Boleyn. Her ascension was controversial as many Catholics considered her illegitimate. She established the English Protestant Church. Her reign saw the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of English drama with writers like Shakespeare, and the expansion of English exploration. She famously never married, styling herself as the Virgin Queen married to her kingdom. She was known for her intelligence, her sharp wit, and her cautious, pragmatic approach to politics. The film Elizabeth, the Golden Age is a sequel to the more historically grounded Elizabeth. This film portrays the Queen, played by Cate Blanchett, during the time of the Spanish Armada. It shows her as a monarch plagued by self-doubt and emotional turmoil. She is depicted as being in love with the adventurer Sir Walter Raleigh, a relationship that is largely fictional. Her political and military decisions seem to be heavily influenced by her emotional state and her personal feelings for Raleigh. The film presents the victory over the Armada as a near miraculous event, with Elizabeth giving an inspiring speech in full armor, but otherwise not being deeply involved in the strategic planning. This portrayal undermines the real Elizabeth's political genius. The historical Elizabeth was anything but weak or indecisive. Her cautiousness was a political strategy, not a sign of emotional fragility. She spent decades navigating a treacherous European landscape, balancing the rival powers of France and Spain. She survived numerous plots against her life and faced constant pressure to marry and produce an heir. She used her unmarried status as a diplomatic tool, dangling the prospect of a marriage alliance to gain political advantage. This was not indecision, It was a masterful long-term strategy. Her relationship with Walter Raleigh was not the central romance of her life, as the film suggests. He was one of many charming and ambitious men at her court. She was fond of him, but she was also his queen. When he secretly married one of her ladies in waiting, she had them both briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London. She was not a woman to be trifled with, and she always put the demands of her role as monarch above her personal feelings. Regarding the Spanish Armada, the film's depiction of her as a bystander who gives a good speech is misleading. While she was not a military commander in the field, she was deeply involved in the preparations for the defense of her kingdom. She appointed her commanders, oversaw the financing of the navy, and was the ultimate authority for the overall strategy. The English victory was not a miracle. It was the result of years of investment in a more modern navy, the skill of English sailors, and a strategy that favored smaller, more maneuverable ships against the larger Spanish galleons. The famous speech at Tilbury was real, and it was a masterpiece of political rhetoric, but it was the culmination of her leadership, not a substitute for it. The film turns a canny and calculating political survivor into a lovelorn and insecure woman, a common trope when depicting powerful female rulers. Number 5. Did Mary, Queen of Scots, have a secret meeting with Elizabeth I? Mary, Queen of Scots, became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old. She was sent to France as a child and was briefly Queen of France. After her husband's death, she returned to Scotland to rule. Her reign was tumultuous, marked by religious conflict and political intrigue. She was eventually forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son James and fled to England, seeking the protection of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, seeing her as a threat, had her imprisoned for nearly 19 years. Mary was eventually executed for her involvement in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth. The 2018 film Mary, Queen of Scots centers on the complex and rivalrous relationship between Mary and Elizabeth. The film culminates in a dramatic secret meeting between the two queens in a remote cottage where they confront each other face to face. It is the emotional climax of the movie, a powerful scene where the two women finally speak their minds directly to one another. This meeting never happened. Mary and Elizabeth, two of the most famous rival queens in history, never once met in person. For the entire 19 years that Mary was a prisoner in England, they communicated only through letters and intermediaries. The filmmakers invented the scene because it is dramatically compelling. It allows for a direct confrontation that encapsulates their entire rivalry in one powerful moment. But it is a complete fabrication that misrepresents the nature of their relationship. Their rivalry was conducted at a distance, through a long and complex game of political chess. Mary, from her confinement, was the focus of numerous Catholic plots to place her on the English throne. Elizabeth's government constantly had to manage the threat she posed. The decision to execute Mary was a political one that Elizabeth agonized over for years. She was famously reluctant to sign the death warrant for another anointed monarch, her own cousin. The story is a tragedy of two powerful women caught on opposite sides of a political and religious divide, whose lives were intertwined but who never actually stood in the same room. The film also takes other liberties. It portrays Mary's Scottish court as more tolerant and diverse than it likely was, and it simplifies the incredibly complex politics of the Scottish Reformation. It also depicts Mary with a Scottish accent when, having grown up in the French court, she would have spoken fluent French and likely spoken Scots with a French accent. By inventing the central meeting, the film chooses emotional drama over historical fact. The real story, of two queens locked in a long-distance Cold War for 2 decades, is perhaps less cinematic, but it is the true history of their relationship. Number 4. Did Catherine of Aragon quietly accept her fate? Catherine of Aragon was the first wife of King Henry V. She was a Spanish princess, the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. She was married to Henry for nearly 24 years. She was a popular queen, known for her piety, intelligence, and dignity. When she failed to produce a male heir, Henry sought to have their marriage annulled so he could marry Anne Boleyn. This led to a massive political and religious crisis. The Pope refused to grant the annulment. Henry's response was to break with the Roman Catholic Church, declare himself the head of the Church of England, and have his own archbishop grant the annulment. In many portrayals, including the early seasons of The Tudors and other dramas, Catherine of Aragon is shown as a tragic and pious victim. She is depicted as a deeply wronged woman who endures her husband's cruelty with quiet suffering and religious fortitude. While her piety and dignity were real, these portrayals often downplay her incredible strength and her active resistance to Henry's campaign against her. She is often seen as a passive figure who is simply swept aside by history. The real Catherine of Aragon was a fighter. She was the daughter of warrior monarchs, and she had a spine of steel. She refused to go quietly. For 7 years, she fought a determined legal and political battle to defend the validity of her marriage and the rights of her daughter Mary as the legitimate heir to the throne. She did not just pray and weep. She actively orchestrated her own defense. She had powerful allies, most notably her nephew Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. She's in constant communication with him and the Pope, making her case and urging them not to give in to Henry's demands. She was a skilled legal mind in her own right. At her trial in 1529, she refused to recognize the authority of the court. In a stunningly dramatic move, she knelt before Henry and gave a passionate speech in her own defense in front of the entire court before walking out and refusing to return. Even after Henry had cast her aside, moved her from castle to castle, and stripped her of her title as queen, she never accepted it. She continued to refer to herself as the Queen of England and insisted her servants do the same, at great personal risk to them. She refused to accept the act of supremacy, which would have meant acknowledging the invalidity of her marriage. Her resistance was a major political problem for Henry for years. She was not a meek and mild victim. She was a principled and unbending opponent who used every political and legal tool at her disposal to fight for her rights and her daughter's future. She lost the battle, but she never surrendered. Number 3 was Anne Boleyn, just a scheming seductress. Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry V and the mother of Elizabeth I. She was a key figure in the English Reformation. Her refusal to be Henry's mistress and her insistence on marriage pushed him to seek an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. After only 3 years of marriage, she was accused of treason and other crimes and was executed at the Tower of London. Her downfall was as swift and dramatic as her rise. The 2008 film The Other Boleyn Girl is one of the most popular and most inaccurate portrayals of Anne Boleyn. The film is based on a novel and depicts Anne, played by Natalie Portman, as a cold, ruthlessly ambitious schemer. She is shown stealing the king's affection from her sweet, innocent sister Mary. The film portrays her as a calculating seductress who manipulates the king to gain power. It even includes a completely fictional plotline where she tries to trick the king with a fake pregnancy and then commits a grievous sin with her own brother to conceive a child. This portrayal is a gross distortion of the historical Anne Boleyn and relies on centuries-old propaganda designed to justify her execution. The real Anne was a highly intelligent and educated woman who had spent time in the sophisticated courts of Europe. She was a woman of strong religious convictions, a supporter of the Protestant Reformation. Her interest in religious reform was genuine and was a major reason why she had powerful enemies at the conservative English court. Her relationship with Henry was not a simple seduction. It was a long and complex courtship that lasted for years. Henry wrote her passionate love letters. She was the one who held him at arm's length, insisting on marriage. This was not just ambition, it was a way to secure her own position and ensure that any children she had would be legitimate heirs to the throne. She was a political player in her own right, with her own faction at court and her own political agenda. The idea that her sister Mary was a simple innocent is also false. The real Mary Boleyn had an affair with the king long before Anne caught his eye, a fact the film gets right, but she was a knowing participant in the games of courtly life. The most damaging part of the film is its depiction of the charges that led to Anne's execution. There is no credible evidence that she committed the crimes she was accused of. These charges were almost certainly fabricated by her political enemies, led by Thomas Cromwell, to get her out of the way so Henry could marry Jane Seymour. The Other Boleyn Girl takes the slanders of her enemies and presents them as fact. It reduces a complex and influential political and religious figure to a one-dimensional, backstabbing villain from a soap opera. Number 2 was Pocahontas, a Disney princess who fell in love with John Smith. Pocahontas was a real person. Her name was Amanut, and she was also known as Mataka. Pocahontas was a childhood nickname. She was the daughter of Powhatan, the powerful chief of a confederation of Algonquin tribes in the area of modern-day Virginia. In 1607, English colonists established the settlement of Jamestown in Powhatan territory. Pocahontas would have been around 10 or 11 years old at this time. The 1995 Disney animated film Pocahontas tells a very different story. It portrays her as a young adult, a beautiful and wise princess who is free-spirited and in tune with nature. She falls in love with the dashing English adventurer Captain John Smith. Their love story bridges the gap between their two cultures and helps to prevent a war. At the end of the film, a wounded Smith returns to England, and Pocahontas stays behind, her love having brought peace to her people. This story is almost entirely fictional. The real Pocahontas was a child when she knew John Smith. Smith himself was a gruff, experienced soldier in his late 20s. There was no romance between them. The famous story of her saving him from execution by laying her head on his is a story that Smith himself told years later. Many historians question its accuracy. It might have been a misunderstanding of a tribal adoption ceremony, or it could have been a complete invention by Smith to make his own story more dramatic. The real life of Pocahontas was far from a fairy tale. Her relationship with the English colonists was complex. She did act as an ambassador between her people and the settlers, and she helped the struggling colony survive by bringing them food. But the peace was fragile. In 1613, when she was around 17, she was captured by the English and held hostage in Jamestown for over a year. During her captivity, she was encouraged to convert to Christianity and was baptized with the name Rebecca. She then married an English colonist, a tobacco planter named John Rolfe. This marriage did bring about a period of peace between the colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy, but it was a political alliance, not the result of a Disney-style romance. In 1616, she, her husband, and their young son traveled to England. She was presented at the court of King James I as a symbol of the Tam Savage and was used as a promotional tool by the Virginia Company to encourage investment in the colony. While in England, she became ill and died in 1617 at the age of only 21 or 22. She never saw her homeland again. Disney took the name of a real historical figure and created a romantic myth that has nothing to do with her tragic and complicated true story. Number 1. Did Mary Tudor's entire reign revolve around her phantom pregnancies? For Mary, was the first queen to rule England in her own right. She was the daughter of Henry V and Catherine of Aragon. A devout Catholic, she is primarily remembered for her attempts to reverse the English Reformation and restore Catholicism to England. During her 5-year reign, she had nearly 300 religious dissenters burned at the stake, earning her the infamous nickname Bloody Mary. She married Philip II of Spain in a deeply unpopular political alliance. She also suffered from 2 phantom pregnancies, a rare medical condition where a woman has all the symptoms of pregnancy but is not actually pregnant. In many popular depictions, including the TV series The Tudors, Mary's reign is often reduced to these 2 elements, her religious persecution and her desperate, tragic desire for a child. She is often portrayed as a bitter, hysterical, and delusional woman. Her political and religious policies are presented as the irrational actions of a woman scorned in her youth and obsessed with her barrenness. Her phantom pregnancies are shown as the central, defining events of her personal and political life, a symbol of her failure as both a woman and a queen. This focus on her personal tragedies, while part of her story, creates a deeply misogynistic caricature. It ignores the fact that Mary was an intelligent, well-educated, and determined ruler who came to the throne against the odds. After her father's death, a plot was hatched to put her Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne instead of her. And Mary did not just weep. She rallied support, raised an army, and rode into London in triumph to claim her rightful crown. This was a massive political victory achieved through her own courage and determination. Her religious policy, while brutal by modern standards, was not the product of hysteria. It was a thought-out, systematic attempt to undo the religious changes made by her father and her half-brother, Edward VI. She genuinely believed that she was saving her people's souls by returning the country to the Catholic faith. The methods she used were harsh, but they were not uncommon in the religious conflicts that were raging across Europe at the time. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was a major political and diplomatic achievement from her perspective. It allied England with the powerful Habsburg Empire. She was not just a lovesick wife. She was a monarch conducting foreign policy. While the marriage was unpopular in England and personally disappointing for her, it was a strategic decision. To frame her entire reign through the lens of her reproductive health is to dismiss her as a serious political figure. Male rulers are judged by their policies, their wars, and their laws. Mary is too often judged by her womb. Her story is a prime example of how the history of a powerful female ruler can be reduced to her personal and biological tragedies, erasing her political agency in the process.